Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the last of our 2040 webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about the really important topics around hope and action and despair and burnout, and how do we actually look after ourselves while we're doing this work. As we've seen throughout the entire series, it doesn't matter which issue you're tackling. There's some challenging issues that we confront as we go along, and the issue of self-care has come up quite a lot. So today we're being joined by the wonderful Bronwyn Gresham, who's a volunteer with Psychologists for a Safe Climate. I think you're a board member, I think, with it's a not-for-profit organisation, and they're working on the challenge of supporting people around fostering psychological and emotional resilience in the area of climate change, which is really important work. So Bronwyn's a clinical psych and a mindfulness practitioner as well. So she's going to be talking us through some of the things that she does and sees in her work. But before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the land that we're all meeting on. If you're joining us from Australia, you'll be meeting on Aboriginal land that has never been ceded, or Torres Strait Islander land. And I'm in Mianjin, otherwise known as Brisbane, so I'm meeting on Yagara and Turrbal lands up here in Queensland. Before we get into this topic, it is a challenging one, especially the timing at the moment with the fires that we've seen across Australia, and a lot of people have been affected directly and indirectly. So, look after yourself during this conversation. Do what you need to do to look after yourself. If this is a triggering conversation for you, we encourage you to seek support, whether it's talking to a friend or somebody professionally after this call, and we'll talk about some resources at the end of the call as well. But in the Q&A, when we get to that, be mindful of what you're sharing, because this is going out into the ether. So if you're sharing personal stories, just think about what you want to share, because it will be public. And on that note, I'd also like to acknowledge everyone who has been impacted by the fires, as well as the amazing work by communities, individuals, volunteers, and the emergency services across Australia. They have just been absolutely phenomenal with what they've had to deal with, and it's been really inspiring seeing how communities have come together to support each other and keep fighting those fires that are still burning and are likely to keep burning for the next couple of months. So it's an amazing story of strength and how we do care. So often when I go into communities, people say, oh, nobody cares anymore. But I think it's times like this we see how much people are strong and do care and can pull together. So I just want to acknowledge that. But Bronwyn, welcome to this afternoon's conversation. Thanks for joining us so close to the Christmas period when everyone's sort of starting to go to the pool or the beach. Maybe we'll start by you telling us a little bit about the work of Psychologists for a Safe Climate. What do you guys do?
Sure. Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you to also to the acknowledgement to country. I just wanted to also send my acknowledgement, because I am currently speaking from Kulin Nation land, and I really am in a bit of a reconciliation journey thanks to the organisation that I work at and the priority that they've made for that journey, and just I guess really wanted to acknowledge the significance of the reconciliation process for our social and emotional well-being, particularly as we are all grappling with climate change, and just the need for, as we mature through this, to really link in again with tradition and ritual and culture and stories to be able to support us through this. So thank you for that acknowledgement. And so Psychology for a Safe Climate is actually, we're coming into our 10th year next year, so we might have to have a bit of a birthday party. We are quite a small not-for-profit, so we're based here in Melbourne, and we are a small group of primarily volunteers, although this year we've trialled having a half-day employee just to help us out with some admin, and we're really hoping to grow that, because we really have, over the past few years, seen quite an increase in demand for our workshops and commentary around articles and panels and conferences, etc. So we kind of began actually around trying to grapple with the concept of denial and trying to figure out, well, what can psychology contribute here in terms of understanding why we're not taking the urgent and radical action that's needed. And so the group really in the beginning was around doing a lot of writing and thinking and hosting some conferences, pulling people in, public speakers like George Monbiot, and her name just slipped my mind, Susan, it's gone. Anyway, she's a Zen Buddhist, she's amazing, Susan Murphy, to really just try to engage our community and get them thinking about all the different kind of perspectives of how psychology can both help us understand and appreciate the challenge, but also nourish ourselves and build our own inner resources. And then sort of, over the years, we began to then focus our work and attention on offering workshops beginning with activists or organisations who were really, in the forefront of the environment and climate change and sustainability. And really those workshops have focused around supporting people with grief and burnout, and have typically kind of followed a bit of a formula around, creative element, drawing. We, could be called art therapy, but that scares people off because some of us can't draw like myself. But it's just incredible how engaging in therapeutic creative processes access emotions on a deeper level and provide permission for us to kind of speak to those emotions less intellectually. So our workshops have kind of got that element, and then towards the end we typically teach some kind of skill that we know has credibility and evidence base, for instance self-compassion. So we've got this kind of formula, I guess, that we've found to be really effective when working with groups in our community.
So what are some of the patterns that you're seeing through the work? Like, what are some of the challenges that keep coming up, or attitudes or things that people are struggling with?
Yeah, it's obviously as diverse as we humans are, but there certainly does seem to be a focus or a really strong felt sense around ecological grief. So a lot of sorrow and everything that grief entails, because it is a very complex emotion, but often kind of seeing a lot of the sorrow element of it, but then also the anger element of it. And, people really feeling quite, I guess, lost within that wave of emotion, and not kind of quite being sure what to do with it. And it's really interesting because, we all know grief. We've all experienced loss on one level or another, whether that be loss of, someone or something that we love, however significant or small. We've all got familiarity with what grief feels like. But I think there's something about ecological grief, because it's not quite yet, it's a bit disenfranchised. It's not quite yet, assumed to be valid. We can kind of feel a bit silly for feeling sadness at, the change in our garden, or, the loss of bushland. And it's such a, it's not something that we can necessarily, of course, control. It's such a natural feeling. I was on the train a couple of months ago on my way into work, and it was the first time I'd heard of the bushfires happening in Lamington National Park and the loss of Binnaburra Lodge. And it just choked me up, because we used to go there as kids and it was such a special place. I'd really hoped to take my kids there one day. And, I just started welling up, just like, and became tearful, like, oh, just trying to kind of control myself still, like on the train. And so I think, and then of course being able to tend to that and give some space to that over the months that have passed. But there's so much, the more we are connecting and realizing that our well-being and our psychological state is not just within this bubble of me, that it's connected to everything around us. We really do feel when things change, and we do feel the loss as if it was ours. So that's one of
It's also, so I guess, I guess it's also it is a different kind of loss too, because it's not it isn't directly personal, and in your own world. Oh, we've lost your camera. Yeah, you're back. It's also, it is something so much bigger than us that we don't have direct agency over. Like there's a sense of disempowerment that I see amongst a lot of people as well. So, you know, and it's the little things, like I was driving out west recently and, oh, Bronwyn, your camera keeps dropping out. Are you still there?
I am definitely still here. I can hear you.
Yeah, there's a little bit of delay on you speaking.
Oh dear.
Oh dear. Okay, I'm just going to change the view for a second, see if it catches up. Sorry, everybody.
Okay.
So let's see. So I'll put me on for a minute, and then when we go back to you, we'll see what happens. Yeah, it's that sense of, I was driving out west about a week ago, and I saw there was a furry creature on the middle of the road. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. It was already very hot. And as I drove closer, it was a koala sitting in the middle of the road, and I'd actually never seen a wild koala before in that part of Queensland. And it just moved off very slowly, but it was looking for water. It was moving towards water, and it was just that moment that should have been sheer joy of seeing a koala was just horror. That there's just, it's been so dry and there's no water, so they're coming out to the roads where there's often more chance of getting water nearby. And it's just, what do you do about that? Like, where's the agency? And it's something that's so much bigger than us. And that anger that gets triggered, and what do you do with that, I think is also really challenging for a lot of people I speak to.
Yeah. No, I think it's totally true. And, you know, the parallels with it, there's just the breadth or the concept of our emotions, particularly around grief or anxiety, have just expanded. And so that there's so many more triggers than we've probably ever been attuned to. And, you know, hence the significant role that we need to play now around boosting our, you know, psychological skills to be able to kind of tolerate and bear those emotions and enable them to move through us and not get stuck. So, you know, we'll get to that, I'm sure, a little bit soon.
Yeah, well, actually, let's talk about that, because I know we talked before the call, and you said you have a useful framework for people that is focused on not just dealing with the trauma or the grief and loss, but also building resilience over long term. So can you talk that through for us?
Sure. So there are quite a few different frameworks out there that can be really beneficial, I think. But one of them that we've been exploring more recently is the framework by Bob Doppelt. And he's a psychologist and has written about the concept of transformational resilience for individuals, communities, and organizations. And and specifically in the context of climate change, and you know, acknowledging that because of the nature of climate change, that we've got, you know, both acute events that are going to be occurring with increasing frequency and intensity, but also quite a lot of kind of chronic slow moving events like sea level rise and drought and displacement, etc. And then, of course, all of the complexity of systems that influences. That he is kind of giving voice to the recognition that our you know, our stress system is getting activated again and again, with not too much time in between events to recover. So, you know, potentially pre climate change, when things were relatively, you know, no massive, huge kind of world like event, we might have certain stresses and challenges in our lives, but we'd have kind of periods of peace and calm and harmony in between to really get back on track and you know, grow and you know, just tend to everyday life. So he's kind of acknowledging that the need for within that to have a framework for individuals and communities to not just kind of bounce back or go to normal, which, you know, of course, that's not even really what we are wanting to aspire to. We don't want to go back to the normal. That's what sort of got us into this problem in the first place. And he speaks about 6 key skill areas and uses an acronym growth. So GROWTH. And I just find this, and I'll speak to them individually, but potentially, you know, listeners can go and explore this online and Google, and even potentially buy his book, which kind of looks like that, if people are looking for it. And so there are two kind of key skill sets around that we need to build when responding to adversity, and whether that adversity is just what you experience, like, you know, observing a koala and having that intense reaction, or for me on the train, hearing the news about Binnabar and having a reaction, or it can be used simply for even really small mundane things like spilling a drink over yourself. You know, these skills they're not discriminatory of distress or stressful situations. So the first set of skills around presencing. So the G stands for ground. So grounding and centering to really calm our nervous system. So this is based on the idea that we respond best to an adversity when we can have some inner regulation and stay kind of calm and grounded, even when the world is shaking around us. So that's a general rule. Obviously, there are times when we are alarmed and we need to act with that level of alarm. So, you know, if there's an immediate danger, we don't want to kind of go calm ourselves and then respond. We just want to go with the emotion of fear. Does that make sense? So this is for, you know, the times when the alarm response may not be beneficial to act on in the moment. So grounding, there's lots of different skills within grounding, but it could be, and so that the idea is really to reduce and to calm the nervous system, to be kind to the body, so that the stress response can run through, and then you can return to kind of a balanced, you know, to homeostasis, as we might say, in order then to respond in a really effective way. The second skill is in the face of adversity is remembering your strengths and values and social support networks. So this is, you know, we know when a trauma hits or a potentially traumatic event hits, the people who recover the quickest are those who link into social supports early. So this is remembering that we've got those social support networks, we've got inner circles, and then we've got he broadens it out to an ecological support system. So he broadens it out to organisations, to then you know, the connections that your organisations might have with other organisations, and then the connection to Earth. So what are the Earth systems and structures that are supporting us in that moment? Water, air, etc. The O stands for observe your reactions, and this is a mindfulness skill, observing our physiological reaction, but also our thought reaction, and really trying to meet the situation in the most objective, non-judgmental way possible. Because we know as soon as we have an adverse experience, our mind is really quick to flick into worry-based thoughts, catastrophizing, personalizing, blaming, all of those thought traps that can really add fuel to the suffering, as opposed to kind of calm things and see things from many different angles so that you can kind of respond widely. So they're the three presencing skills, and you can see how there's lots of meat in all of them, and the book goes through lots of different really accessible activities that people can go through in groups or by themselves. And then the second set of skills are purposing skills. The W stands for watching for new insights and for meaning. And this is specifically related to climate-induced hardships. And this can be really tricky, this one, because sometimes it can get misinterpreted as like trying to find the silver lining, or which can then feel really invalidating. So it's really important that it's just trying to see things from many different perspectives, to try to just look out for even small little insights or glimmers of gold where you can make sense of the situation in a meaningful way. So it's sort of like what I might call making lemonade out of lemons, but not forgetting that they're lemons in the first place. It's just to really introduce different perspectives rather than staying stuck on one. The second purposing is around tapping into values that you may want to live by in amidst the climate adversity. And this is something I feel like has become spoken about a lot more within the climate change community, certainly with workshops I've gone to, and you know, values-oriented or values-driven behaviour has become prominent in our language, and thinking about what our intrinsic values are and our social values, etc. I feel like that's becoming more commonly understood. For instance, through the Common Cause project, that's one area that people can look into. But this is from a psychological perspective, increases our choice, because there are some times when being emotionally driven is needed and warranted and valid. For instance, if someone does something wrong by me and I have anger as a response, so anger is an emotion that tells us that an injustice has happened, that motivates us and kind of orients our attention to that situation to say, hey, something needs to be done here. So I want to kind of act on that emotion. Whereas other times, potentially it's not the person's fault. So just yesterday, actually, my husband was putting our pram back in the car and my keep cup, which is glass, slipped out of it. Anger, instantly angry because it's his fault, right? However, thankfully, thanks to Brené Brown and her beautiful clip on blame, which everyone should definitely see at least once in their lives, hold on. I used my grounding skills. I breathed. I calmed my nervous system. And then I remembered that, it's not his fault that I got a keep cup made of glass. It's no one's fault that when glass hits asphalt that it smashes. You can open up different perspectives. So it's kind of like that. If I had acted on that anger, what would have spat out of my mouth was, why did you do that? Why don't you say sorry, as if it's his fault, but it's not. So the anger makes sense. It's understandable because I felt like, I'd lost my keep cup and I loved that key cup, and, it's an injustice, but it's not, it doesn't fit the situation. So it's not warranted to act on that anger. So almost in the situations when our emotion doesn't fit the situation, it's like we have to do opposite action. So the opposite of how we feel. So I felt angry. I could have ranted at him and made him apologize, but really, what was needed was just to calm myself and to apply compassion and understanding and, letting go, which is the opposite of anger. Tells us to hold on and to fight for something, whereas the opposite action is letting go in
This
that
is a really,
situation.
I think this is a really, really, really important point, because I've worked with different NGOs around the world and with people working on really tough issues, so not just climate change. Sorry, leaf blower next door. That's just great timing.
I can't hear it, so hopefully no one else can.
And it's interesting. I've always asked people I really admire who've been doing really hard work for decades, like what keeps them going. And so often you get the response, anger. And I know it's a fuel for a lot of climate activists as well. And it's something that doesn't work for me, just personality-wise. I feel like it burns me up, and then I'm completely useless. Anger's not an emotion that's a motivator for me, but it is for some people. And I think going back to your original point is really important. I hadn't thought of it this way before, because I've always thought of anger is that moment where, as I've gotten more comfortable with anger, it does energize. So how do you use the energy around it, but stick with your values? Because so often if people are just focusing on keeping the anger going, they can sometimes make decisions about things that aren't actually in line with their bigger values and why they're doing what they're doing in the first place.
Absolutely.
So it's how you balance that. Because it's not about suppressing anger or rejecting anger. It's actually, okay, there's an injustice. Like you said, it's an injustice. There's something that needs me to move or act, but how do I come back and kind of go, what's actually going on? So exactly what you said, observing what's actually happening, being grounded enough to go, well, how do I come back to my values? What's really the bigger picture here that we need to be working towards, that we can be strategic about?
Yeah, absolutely. And in order for you to do that, you are really pulling on a lot of resources. You're pulling on your self-awareness, you're putting words to your experience, and you're beginning to tap into what's your goal in this moment really? What is it that you're really trying to achieve, and how can you do that with maintaining your self-respect and dignity intact? And so you're pulling on a lot of different resources in order to regulate that emotion in that moment to guide your actions.
And it's not always possible. Don't always do that very well.
No, neither. Trust me, neither.
What was the last one? Was there
the last one, yes, is
before
H. It's harvest for hope. So looking for new possibilities by making choices that increase our personal, social, and environmental well-being. So I like that idea of how he said harvest hope. He hasn't just said hope, and it's similar to what Joanna Macy describes, that active hope, and the two different hopes, that we can't really rely on the hope where we only do something when we know there will be a particular outcome, because that can really dismantle us and demotivate us. We have to kind of act for what we want, regardless of the outcome. So that's the values-oriented way, and that's what the principle of active hope. But I was thinking about what you said, and one of the the pieces here I feel like that our workshops tap into, but also that we're grappling with, is trying to appreciate the complexity of emotions. And we are beginning to see a shift in news stories and dialogues from the dichotomy, hope versus despair, fear versus anger, into a more nuanced and complex picture. So I'm really happy to see that, because I guess, as a psychologist, we learn that every single emotion has validity and a function, and that, our emotions are like systems of experience. So they constitute like body sensations that have no words. They constitute, specific thoughts that are attuned to that, emotion, but they also constitute urges, and urges to act in a particular way. So, when we feel sad, we often have the urge to kind of isolate or withdraw, or just kind of go down. And when we feel love, we have the urge to share and to reach out. But whether we act on those emotions is another element, the behavior. So sometimes we suppress that behavior, other times we are reactive to that behavior. But then, fundamentally what we want to do is teach some skills that people can recognize their emotions, engage in what's really important to them, and then choose their effective behavior. So it's kind of like slowing the emotion down. And the skills that Bob Doppelt's talking about, presencing and purposing, they all lend to be able to do that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, great. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about burnout and what we should be looking for as signs of burnout, because it can happen, it takes a while, but it's suddenly upon people, and then it's very hard to recover from. So what should people be looking out for, because especially when there's so many different stimulus going on?
Yeah. Oh, it's such a good question. So burnout, most people have a sense of what it is, because most people, certainly who've worked in the environment movement or climate change, even for only a year, have had moments of feeling burnout. And as an experience, just to clarify for the record, there are kind of a few different elements. The burn element is when we get caught up in irritability, frustration, agitation, heat. And then the out part is when we get depleted, exhausted, fatigued. And then within that is the relational component, like we just begin to, either attack others or withdraw, or there's that social element. And so I think it is really important to look out for. And ways that people could do that is if they do find that they're not enjoying things that they usually would enjoy. They're going for their usual walks in nature, or they're going for their usual social outings, but they're feeling really disconnected, or not in the moment, that their mind's elsewhere. And also if emotions begin to linger. So, if an emotion of sorrow or guilt or shame or anger or despair, if that's, activated and just stays for days and days, that might be a sign that, you need some support in being able to help that work through. Also, if relationships begin to become more difficult, or you become disconnected, and also if, just kind of daily routines and more physiological things get impacted, like sleep, your, eating, your alcohol or drug use, there's lots of different signs that you might not be coping as in a healthy way as you possibly could. And then, of course, if you've got a lot of thoughts of giving up, of, working in a library, nothing wrong with working in a library, but if you, work in sustainability and you're thinking of changing jobs, my one, when I was...
I have a list of 6 jobs on those
Well,
days.
I say working in the library because I often think about working in the library. I'm like, that was like when I was little what I wanted to do. But and I know I also wanted to be a jockey. So
Travel writer.
yeah. But you begin fantasizing about your escape. So that it's different for all of us, but it's the worst is when you get to that point of absolute despair and you're at rock bottom. We really want to try to activate supports much more early than that to prevent getting into that really dark space, because that's when particularly people who are attuned to the complexity of climate change and the existential crisis that we face, there is a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, a lot of sorrow connected to that. And, we know also that people can experience thoughts of ending their life, or, that our thinking can get quite extreme in that way. So it's really, really important that we reach out at those points, because that everything's impermanent and there's supports out there that can really help.
One of the things, I'm going to encourage everyone now to start thinking about questions, because we'll go to questions soon, but also think about sharing any resources or tools that people who are listening in on the call might use. Like, that'd be good for us all to share that. One of the things that helped me was actually we used to prepare volunteers to go overseas at Engineers Without Borders, and we had this amazing group called Mandala, who were psychologists who were preparing people to live in often quite stressful situations overseas. And what they did was they didn't give people a list of things to do or what to look out for. What they did is they stepped us through a self-care plan. So the first thing they asked us was identify the signs of stress, and it can be the thoughts that you have, the sorts of how does that play out in terms of behaviour. So do you start drinking more, or just watching TV, or so it was what sort of words, what sort of things do you start hearing come out of your mouth? How do you feel? What's the emotions, and what's the physiological signs as well? Like, what do you feel in your body? Do you get, because it's different for different people. I think we often think there's this list, but getting us to reflect on that in advance of going into the stressful situation was useful. And then talking about, and then they got us to brainstorm 2 other things. So one is what keeps us kind of going in everyday life. What are the sorts of routines that we have that keep our stress levels in check? That's preventative. And then what do we do when we do start to feel stress, and actually getting us to list that out. And again, sort of behavioral stuff, or things that we do for our body, or, how do we nourish body, mind, spirit kind of things.
Yeah.
And it was really useful. And I've used it with activists as well, because so often we're so busy, we end up in the situation before we know it, we're really stressed out. And sometimes having that to go back to is really useful in those moments where you can't think of what to do, and it's kind of going back to basics around that. It's like, am I burnt out? Like, what are my thoughts? How is this manifesting in my behaviour? And sharing that with other people who are close to you, including work colleagues or other volunteers that you're working with on projects, so they can start to see the signs of stress that you might not see before it's too late. So that was just it's a useful group exercise to do if you're working in a community group or a climate action group.
And it's such an empowering way to do it, because we all do have our own resources, and we all have that knowledge within us. So often when we're feeling at a loss, we look to reading a book or asking an expert, but we all have that knowledge within. We have to trust that there's an intuition there, that we know what's best for ourselves. And I love that reflective piece of just, having the framework or the questions that invite, us to self-reflect, and that's going to land in a much more memorable way. And actually, in the moments, and you're going to remember it more accurately than if someone's told you to do something, because you've already kind of imagined yourself engaging in it in that way. And that's, it's like, it's tapping into the skill of mental rehearsal. We might call it cope ahead, where we actually imagine a struggle that we might face in the future, like getting triggered or experiencing something challenging, and we imagine how we'd like to see ourselves coping. Like, how do we want to show up at our best, even when things are at their worst? And
Mm.
once we can imagine that, we can then call up that resource much more readily in the moment when we need it. Yeah.
Great. Are there any other, before we go to questions, any other kind of protective factors that we do know from the research that feeds into resilience, not just coping, but
Yeah.
things that we know people who have, these sorts of things tend to be more resilient?
Yeah.
That wasn't a very
That's a
articulate
good
question.
question.
I hope you know what I mean.
I'm probably not going to like get a quick Google. No, I guess just intuitively, maybe between you and I, we can think of something like the social connection is one that comes to mind first and foremost. But also, there are some protective factors that are not totally within our control, like, having housing, having a stable income, um, having that kind of the socioeconomic status be supportive of us, that's kind of can be quite a key factor, protective factor. But I think like a regular practice in taking care of your body and your mind and your soul, whatever combination of things, whether that's going to the gym or just going for a walk in nature, or whether it's meditating, having kind of like a repertoire of things that you do that kind of boost up your and buffer your psychological and spiritual health. So yeah,
Hmm.
I mean, most evidence-based things are around mindfulness and meditation and connection with nature, and there is a really
Gratitude
good
practices. Yeah.
absolutely. So
Yeah.
there's a really good framework called the 5 Ways to Wellbeing, which was a collation of quite an extensive literature review, and they came up with the 5 ways that do tap into a lot of different frameworks. But yes, give is one. So recognizing gratitude, and certainly that's really aligned with the work of Joanna Macy, who has done so much for the
Mm.
activist community, and everything that they do is grounded in gratitude. And so
Mm.
having an appreciation for the really, really simple everyday things in life, but also being able to attribute that to something beyond ourselves. Like there's two key components of gratitude, and then the other four are be active, connect. Gonna have to can't remember. We're gonna have
We
to
can
Google
find,
that
yeah, well, we can find the link because as we
one.
always try and do after the recordings, we haven't been 100% successful, but we will post
Yeah. Yep.
the resources, so we can look up the
Yep.
link and post that on the
Fantastic.
website with the recording. Let's go to the participants who are on the call and get their questions, because I think that's really important. And I'm just seeing time's getting away from us. So
Yeah.
if you've got questions, send them through to Bree, and we'll start looking at them. We've got some already. This is excellent. One from Lorraine. Bronwyn, in talking about ecological grief, have you come across the work of Glenn Albrecht,
Yeah.
and his concept of solastalgia, the pain or
Yeah.
distress caused through a change in our immediate environment, the homesickness you have when you're still at home on this book? His book is called Earth Emotions.
Yes. That's
Ah,
yeah.
there you go.
That's amazing. Yes, his concept of soul stage has been incredibly beneficial, and it's really been. I feel like it's been really embraced over the past, 5 or so years, maybe even longer. So Lorraine, you might know more about when it originated, but yes, and his new book now kind of covers not just he expands on some of the um, more challenging, distressing emotions we feel in connection with Earth, but also some of the beneficial emotions that nourish and support us as well. And admittedly, I sometimes get lost in some of the language he uses. It is a bit of a different language that he uses. He's a philosopher, and there's lots of words. So that's something I have to get my head around. Really helpful concept. So thank you, Lorraine, for bringing that up. It's such a
Yeah.
beneficial resource, and I think again it's just expanding our minds to our concept of self from me to we and then back to me, and that it's kind of more fluid and dynamic and interconnected. And I feel like the community is really wakening up, particularly with the mindfulness and meditation being embraced so much, that these concepts are really beginning to filter really more deeply within our community. So
Great. Really, really good question, this one that's coming up from Jeremy. Thank you for taking the time to do this. As a father of 2 young children, nearly 7 and 3, I wonder how I can best prepare them for a world that will be very different from the one that I grew up in. They are blissfully unaware of it now. Do you have any advice on this? Oh, this is a big one.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. You're reading probably a lot of people's minds. And it's something that, as a mum myself of 2 daughters, I'm thinking of on a regular daily basis. One of the resources I'll point you to explore that you may already know of was written by the Australian Psychological Society, and they have written a couple of resources for one on speaking to children about climate change, but another resource on, you know, what are the social emotional skills that children, well, anyone needs really, but what are the ones that children need that they'll benefit from in the context of climate change. So that's a really good resource to look up. And they're no different to what they'll need regardless of the world that we're coming into. Just that, you know, climate change probably has prompted us as parents to really prioritize thinking about how we can, you know, foster and harness emotional well-being and intelligence within our children, and also know how we ourselves can have difficult conversations with our family and friends, so that when it comes to our children, we are able to kind of speak to what we're feeling, to put words, you know, that there is this really important function of being able to put words on how we feel, to then being able to self-regulate. These kind of cute phrases are not what we name, we can tame. What you feel, you can heal. You know, that they're really functional, basic, but often forgotten emotions to cultivate, or sorry, resources, inner resources to cultivate. So hopefully those 2 will just get you thinking. And, you know, I think joining parents for climate action groups can be really beneficial here. And it's not something you think about once and then let go. It is like an ongoing, you know, conversation, an ongoing, you know, thinking of what
I think that
we
there's
can do.
So I think that's something often that we forget about too, in having the conversation and being brave enough to start the conversation and name it. It actually is communicating trust as well. It's trust to your kids that we'll figure this out somehow. Yeah, we don't get to control everything, but we'll find a way through, and I trust that you'll be resilient through that. And I think sometimes shying away from the conversations, I notice in the work that I do with regional communities, everyone's too scared to have the conversation, and underneath that is a subliminal message that we don't trust you to cope, we don't trust you to handle this. And it actually increases the fear and uncertainty and lack of agency and disempowerment by not even having the conversation as a starting point, because you don't always have the answers, but you can start the conversation and say, how do we figure this out together?
Absolutely. I think that's actually a really key point, Amanda, and I just want to like raise it to the surface, is that you know, we are on each other's sides and we are in this together, that sometimes we face traumas in our families that are nothing to do with climate change, but are just as humongous, and you know, there's no kind of fixing it or in that moment, it is what it is. And I think we have to have some basic level of faith that we will bring to that the resources that we have, and the best way we can do that is together. And you know, so it's not a, you know, it's kind of remembering that we've all had existential crises to one level or another. We've all gone through difficult times, and it's how do we learn from those and help our children in those moments when things just seem beyond repair. What, you know, how do you still function and find meaning? And this comes back to, you know, the purposing set of skills that Bob Doppelt speaks to. You know, the choice that we have in those moments is, you know, how we create and live in that moment, despite things not being the way we want them to, even though we wish they were different.
Beautiful. Okay, other questions. So in your work so far, maybe we've sort of touched on this, Have you
Yeah.
found differences from people of different ages? For example, young people, Gen X, Gen Y, or baby boomers, in terms of resilience or how they're reacting? That's a really great question.
Yeah, that is a really good question. Yeah, because we do get quite, in the beginning we got a lot more, we didn't get many younger people at our workshops, but definitely the past few years has seen a more kind of even spread of age groups. So with the older generations, I see a lot of kind of anxiety around their grandchildren, and how their grandchildren, and a lot of guilt around
Yep.
their generational legacy. Um, and there's a lot that they're grappling with there. And then with, people under 40, particularly in their 20s and 30s, who haven't yet had children or do have young children, really grappling, for those without children, really grappling with whether they will have children or not. And that, of course, is, the flavour of that is very individualised, because some, come in with their own particular reasons for wanting children regardless of climate change. But climate change just adds this whole other kind of lens or layer of complexity, and not just around, increasing carbon emissions if I bring another child into this world, but, the experience of the child, of what's to come or what is currently here. And then those with children, similar to what Jeremy was saying, just being on their mind and thinking, well, how am I going to, this is the greatest issue, the greatest health threat, this is the issue of our time. How can I still allow my children a childhood, of play and creativity in the moment, which they're really good at, as we know. Yeah, they don't really need much reminding to play, they just do it. But then, how can I make sure that, and this is for many other issues, the age of technology, use of gaming machines, social media, bullying and harassment, like there's so many kind of really key, huge issues of our time that are kind of flavors of the same problem. So that, so there are generational differences, I think.
Definitely, yeah. Because I really resonate when you said that a lot of the older generations, the level of guilt and how that manifests in the conversations, as opposed to younger people who have a different starting point for thinking about it and what their emotions are.
Yeah, and my heart really goes out to that, because I think this is where I think then returning to understanding the function of emotions, and none of us choose who we're born to, what country we're born into, what time or era we're born into. That's not our fault, and none of us have chosen what culture we become immersed in, and what patterns of behavior there are some things that we just didn't choose, but we've landed in anyway. And I really feel with guilt, it's something that I would be surprised if no one felt guilt any of the time. I certainly grapple with it a lot. And so I feel like guilt is a really important emotion to observe when it happens, to be able to decide for yourself whether it's warranted and valid, or and helpful, and to act on that guilt. So acting on guilt would look like making amends for the transgression, committing to not making the same mistake again, and engaging in behavior change to do better. Whereas unwarranted guilt is when the guilt remains, even though we've made the changes, we're still beating ourselves up about the same thing. The intensity doesn't kind of match the situation anymore, and yet we're still kind of triggering it off by kind of beating ourselves up. So that would require opposite action, and like trying to let it go. Kind of radical acceptance and self-compassion that we're all uniquely fallible and accountable. It's complex.
And also being careful around not taking guilt on that isn't, you actually have no,
absolutely,
you can't actually take action for anyway. And even if you're part of the society, and you are contributing by existing, it's actually not something you can directly do systems level change about, but starting with where you're at and what actions you can take as a starting point. That's been a theme through all of the webinars, actually, is start with where you're at, what you do have agency, what's within your sphere of control, because that can then lead, not just every little action leads to cumulative effect of a big action, but also builds resilience, it builds skills, it builds networks, which then can lead you taking bigger steps
Yeah.
and joining with other people around the systems change stuff as well. I'm just
I
going to go to
love
some more questions.
Yeah, can I just quickly like pick out something that's so important
Yeah.
in what you said, because I just really want to highlight it, is with guilt, it's a very individualized emotion often. Like, I've done something wrong, I've caused it, I'm the problem. And it's connected to that sense, like the little actions that we do here, there, like bit by bit, that sometimes we undermine them by saying, well, that's not going to solve the problem. But we've got to then return to the we, like we're all in this together, we are all contributing. Like, a lot of people who come to our workshops feel so isolated and alone, like they're the only ones who care. And coming to our workshops is a reminder and a felt experience that, oh, everyone else is in the same boat as me. Like, I can see that people do care. So yeah, it's really important to keep reminding ourselves that our little bit is one contribution to everyone else's, and that it's
Yeah.
together. Like, this is a like humanity thing, not a me
Yeah.
thing.
I think
Yeah.
that's been one of the, I actually had some feedback from someone I ran into about these webinars, and that's what they said,
Yeah.
was it was just a reminder that they're not the only ones who care, and it was just
Yeah.
refreshing to see so many people tuning in and actually joining the discussion on the Facebook. So I encourage
Yeah.
everyone, even though the webinars aren't going to continue that I know of, keep engaging with the Facebook site and
Yeah.
contributing those ideas, because it actually helps to build that collective sense of connection and resilience.
Yeah.
We've got a few more
Absolutely.
questions, but we're running out of time. So I'm just one more of a comment. So I'm going to read that out and then I'll go to the next question. This discussion is revealing the main concepts of Stoicism as developed around 2,000 years ago by Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and others. It works for many today, including Obama. So I guess that's from Christine Young. So we'll take that as a comment. And maybe because we've only got a little bit of time left, Peter Morgan's asking about how do cultural differences play out in this space of grieving. And I think that's a really important thing to touch on as well, because it's not just universal emotions. Culturally, I guess how we express them, what we express, what we even notice as a valid emotion is framed by culture. So
Mm,
yeah, what have you noticed in your work around, especially the question
absolutely.
around grieving?
Yeah. Well, and sometimes, that we, like, culture is not always visible either. So in our workshops, it's hard. You can't always make assumptions. But yeah, there are different, cultural differences in how grief is expressed and processed and ritualized. How acceptable it is to show externally versus, keeping it within and private. And I think all of those things need to be taken into consideration when thinking about, like, how do we kind of help each other to support ourselves through this, and to do it in a way that is respectful of individual and cultural differences, and not kind of forcing my way on someone that it's just not going to land with them. And I think that definitely comes into play, when we're just chatting with our friends, or our colleagues, who we've just got to respect. We've all got our different ways, and find that shared common ground, which is, love and care and, common humanity, and, harnessing our strengths of being human. And there are so many. I know climate change is really an expression of our shadow, but there are so many strengths coming through, not just in connection with climate change, but in social movements like the Me Too movement. There's so much change happening that I wish we could take that into account when they do the climate modelling, honestly. Like, if we could just see the impact, because this is there's such protective factors, what's going on. So sorry, that was a bit of a tangent, but I don't know if, Amanda, you might have any other comments around the cultural
I think
differences.
also,
Might work with that.
yeah, I like what you said about the invisibility of it too. And maybe also watching when we jump to conclusions about where other people are at on this issue, because particularly in the work I'm doing in regional areas, there's cultural differences between the city and the
Yeah,
bush, and even within each community, there's cultural differences, as well as
yeah,
people coming from different cultural backgrounds. And
yeah,
so it's about not jumping to a conclusion about when somebody says something, oh, you're a denialist. And I think
yeah,
the tribalism that has been cultivated around, if you're not with me, you're against me kind of
yeah,
attitude that is increasing and is going
yeah,
to, I'm seeing is getting worse,
yeah,
is how do we take that time to stop, like you're saying, ground, take a deep breath and ask the question rather than jumping to a
yeah,
conclusion about.
Yeah.
because there's so many trigger words now that people listen for and
I
immediately they're
know.
going to peg you or
I know.
you're going to peg them. So
Yeah.
I like that idea of come back to the humanness and the
Yeah.
connection, and maybe starting from the how do I bring my best self, you said that before, to this
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah.
How do I expect the best from the other people I'm talking with
Yeah.
rather than expecting the worst, and
Yeah.
being open and curious with
Yeah.
that, which is a sign of respect, really, rather than saying
Yeah.
you are this or
Yeah.
yeah.
And I guess it also speaks to, just being able to see ourselves in others. No matter how different we are, there is always something that is reflective. And I guess making the fundamental assumption that we are all doing the best we can given the circumstances that we're living in, and given our individual resources, our social resources. Just, yeah, I guess walking into conversations with that fundamental assumption can be really beneficial. And I guess identifying that we all experience denial on some level or another. It is, again, a very nuanced and multi-layered, experience and concept. And yeah, so I think anytime we find ourselves getting agitated and like you're good, you're bad, or like, that splitting, we know that we've become a little bit dysregulated and we need to kind of ground ourselves, breathe, and begin to open to the many, many, many ways of seeing the situation.
And taking time out when we need to take time out, and
Yeah,
doing to get us
absolutely.
back connected into the bigger picture again. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
which is the best time of year to be doing this.
I know. Everyone get into some kind of see nature, whether it's the garden or the sky. If you're stuck in the city like I am, you know, Mother Nature is us, and we can,
Mm.
it's our restorative practice. So,
Hmm.
mm,
Well, we're about out of time. Thank you so much, Bronwyn. That was a really nourishing conversation. I really appreciate you joining us, and great timing on the topic as well. Um,
well,
and
and thank you
that's
for putting this series together, Amanda. You've been amazing. What an
uh,
accomplishment. So hope you can soak it in and enjoy like the reward of putting such a valuable resource together for people.
oh, thank you. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Like I've really enjoyed it, and I really want to thank Bree, who's been in the background managing all the tech stuff and making sure things are advertised, and has just been really great at keeping me on track. And all the
Mm,
2040 crew, so Anna and Kim and Damon, for trusting me to put this on as well. It was kind of just an idea that came out of the Q&A, that people wanted to keep the conversation going. So we just sort of went, well, what would that look like? And it's just been an absolute honour and pleasure, to all the presenters that have joined, but also the participants who've joined in with the Q&A discussion. So thank you everyone for joining us, and
yeah.
please share it. Like over the Christmas period, people are often looking for things, they've got a bit more time on their hands. So, and if people are feeling especially a bit despairing, to share a lot of the conversations, because kept coming back around to hope, but in a grounded sense around,
Mm,
yes, the challenges are immense, but there are so many amazing people who are, facing it and doing some, not just tackling the issues of climate change, but actually creating a
mm,
much better world on a number of
mm.
fronts. And it's been incredibly inspiring to hear about what's going on. So please share it. And I think we'll be trying to cut some of the videos up so they're even a bit more shareable on social media. So keep an eye out for that. So on that note, thanks, Bronwyn. I hope everyone has a
Thank you.
wonderful festive season. Stay safe and have a wonderful 2020, and stay involved on the Facebook site, and hopefully we'll see you somewhere else. Thanks, everyone.
Marvelous. Thank you so much. See you
Thank
later.
you. Bye.